Hey, Mr. President, I appreciate the well. I tell you what, I said earlier today my favorite time of day was recognizing CTSOs, but I tell you what, I like selling stuff too as an auctioneer, and we've got something big to sell today. We have $6 billion in surplus revenue. All right, what do you say here? Don't better hear about it. It's been well advertised. We all know $6 billion. I tell you what, if that ain't enough money to spend today, no problem. All you got to do, walk across the street there at Trinity, and you'll find the Office of Bonds, the Finance Department. We've got some of those folks here in the room. They'll get you right fixed up, ready to go. 6.5% will be your interest rate. All right, what do you say here? Now going to be down $30 billion. And now $30 billion going to be down 35 here, Mr. Chairman. I got you. $35 billion want to be 40. And now $40 billion going to be down 50. $50 billion. And got the Democrat in the back now. $50 billion going to be down 60. $60 billion on a bidder. He would buy him $60 billion. Lord have mercy. You're going to bid $60 billion? My goodness, Mr. President, there's people in this room who'd spend $60 billion if they had it. I can't imagine what $60 billion would look like. That'd double the taxes of every Georgian, would it not? $60 billion, we're at 32 today. Mr. President, I add some humor to what I'm about to say in the spirit of moderation in our state, a fine principle of our state, moderation. Because what I'm about to say is hard to hear, and trust me, it's hard to say. You know, I don't think that the position of our state when it comes to finances is any fault of the chairman of appropriations of the 19th. It's not the fault of the governor. They're all doing their jobs. The finances of this state is brought to us by this body and the body across the way. Now today, I'm going to object to the budget, if that's not already clear. I'll probably be the only red sign up there. Mr. President, I find it kind of humorous because when you look at Communist China and their big General Assembly, it's all the same when they vote. But our only constitutional duty in this state is to pass a budget. That's it. All the regulation that we bicker about in this room, that's not necessary. All the mandatory minimums we bicker about in this room, that's not necessary. But this budget, how we spend the dollars, that's necessary. I tell you what, Mr. President, we always hear in this chamber that we're the #1 state to do business in. But I tell you what, you go back to Northwest Georgia and you start telling that to folks and they'll laugh at you because they'll look across that border and they don't see any income taxes. Mr. President, sometimes, and this is a true story, I was talking to a merchant in Northwest Georgia who was loading up one of these big rigs, 90,000 pounds gross vehicle weight. He was loading up his inventory to ship it out of state because he didn't want to pay inventory tax. Now, granted, our state doesn't have inventory taxes, but our counties are so broke in Northwest Georgia that they'll tax you. They'll tax that inventory right away. But, Mr. President, that truck driver who was going to haul that inventory out of the state to avoid those inventory taxes, he didn't stop at the convenience store in Georgia to buy his fuel. He drove on into Tennessee to fill up because their fuel tax is lower than ours here in Georgia. And, Mr. President, I'm good friends with a fellow who sells truck insurance in Northwest Georgia. All of his employees, all of his business happens in Tennessee because none of his employees want to work in Georgia and pay an income tax. You know, one of the solutions to heavy tax in this budget is $1 billion as a rebate to homestead exemption. Mr. President, you can walk outside of this chamber and before long you're liable to bump elbows with a county commissioner. And let me tell you what, those county commissioners up in Northwest Georgia, they like taxing folks. So citizens who receive that rebate check, they might as well just sign the back of it and give it right back to the government because the government's going to tax them anyway. But you can't blame the commissioners. They've got to do a job. Mr. President, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I took a tour of a county jail, and what I discovered there was horrendous. About 40% of the inmates there were all on state probation violation. You know, we can say we're going to try to solve crime. We can just, pass all these mandatory minimums we want, but when they get into court and they start making plea bargains, they end up being probation violations, and guess who takes care of the burden? It's not the state, it's our county jails. Another 40% or so, well, they suffer from mental illness. Mr. President, the county taxpayers, in some instances, are paying $1,000 a week per inmate for medication. And that's all on the county taxpayer. And I feel sorry for our sheriffs because they can't recruit anybody. You know why they can't recruit anybody? They're constitutionally mandated to do jobs for us as a state, but we can't offer them any medical retirement. Mr. President, we got Eighth Amendment violations happening in jails across this state when it comes to mental health. We can't offer anything else. Mr. President, about 5 years ago, when talking about law enforcement, we had about 65,000 law enforcement officers across the state. That's state troopers, that's sheriff's deputies. Now we're down to about 45,000. Population's grown by about 1 million. So you'd think if we're worried about gang and crimes, we would get some more law enforcement officers to enforce the laws that we already have. Mr. President, we've got an immigration crisis at the border, and it's found its way into northwest Georgia. Our executive branch goes to the world stage and says, secure the dang border. But there's no money in this budget. We got $6 billion left over, and we're not doing anything to stop the cartels coming out of Mexico. You see, we like to find solutions to the evident problem. It's like kudzu growing in northwest Georgia. We need to go after the root of the problem, Mr. President. But just to equal, think about our state troopers. You see, there was a state trooper in northwest Georgia who was traveling up 75 not too long ago, chasing a felon down. He broke his neck in the line of duty. The best the state can offer him in medical retirement is insurance and $1,100 a month. That's all we got. Because we had some austerity cuts back in 08 and 09, and we've never recovered that medical retirement. You see, we've got a historic surplus, but we're not doing many historic things with that surplus. Mr. President, equal to public safety is transportation. I'm honored to serve on the Transportation Committee in this Senate. And I've been to the Chamber of Commerce events, and I've heard the big wigs of transportation, the guys who sell the rocks, the gals who sell the concrete and the asphalt. All of them tell me the cost is going up 40%. But I don't see in the next budget our expenditures in transportation going up 40%. You see, to me, transportation is probably the most important thing we could ever do in a state. Look at the ancient empires, this temple that we stand in today, right? It looks like one of those ancient temples that the statesmen debated in back in the day of the ancient Syrians. They spent every tax dollar they had on infrastructure. The Romans, they spent it on infrastructure. Ever heard of the Roman road? Mr. President, my constituents are upset about some simple stuff, and I'm sure all of you have constituents upset about some simple stuff. What do I mean by simple stuff? I mean things like caution lights. There's 4 or 5 caution lights in northwest Georgia, Mr. President, that citizens have been asking for since I served in the House across the way. $50,000 expenditure. I go to the Commissioner of Transportation. He said, it's not a financing issue. It's an engineering issue. Well, I beg to differ then if it's a financing issue. We need more money to hire more engineers to take care of this simple stuff. That's the proper role of government. If we don't have those caution lights, we've got fatalities. Legitimate fatalities, and we continue to ask for those caution lights. You see, people expect the government to work for them. They don't expect to work for us. University System of Georgia has produced professors who have written articles, white papers, well-studied, that say $250 of every tax dollar a Georgian sends in now goes to subsidize the film industry. You see, Mr. President, the poor folks in Northwest Georgia, all they can afford is to send me to advocate for them. They can't afford a bunch of bigwig plastic badges outside to advocate for them. They're sick and tired of paying high taxes just to subsidize big corporations. You see, they're billion-dollar industries, and they're writing and making movies about death, and we're paying for it as taxpayers, but yet we've got death on our roads because we can't afford caution lights. Mr. President, I think it's ironic that I'm the youngest member of this chamber, and I seem to be the only one worried about our interest when it comes to debt. You got a big budget there on your desk, and I challenge any of you to go in there and find how much interest we're paying on our bonds. I took a trip across Trinity, and it was mighty difficult to figure it out. We know we've got about $9 billion in bonds. We know we're paying anywhere from 2 to 6.5% interest on those bonds. At the max, that'd be $650 million a year, would it not? Imagine all the things we could do with $650 million extra dollars we weren't paying interest on. But what's ironic is what I hear is we have billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars in tax liabilities. Not just the film industry, but all across the board. And it just seems like if there's about $8 billion in tax liabilities and we've got $10 billion in debt, we've just borrowed a bunch of money to subsidize a bunch of corporations, and we've forgotten what is the proper role of government. Mr. President, this is an historic budget, $6 billion. I don't think that's ever happened. And we're not doing meaningful things to lower the cost of living in Georgia. We're going to give a one-time government gimme handout, a little payola to the citizenry. But, Mr. President, that doesn't help my kids. That doesn't help my grandkids. And I ask that you consider these things before you vote. Mr. President, I will be voting no today, and those are the reasons why. And I yield the well. Thank you.